My name's Amy McDonald. I'm the director of CitySpace. And tonight is our last program to celebrate Earth Week, and we could not be more thrilled to have Leah Penniman as our guest. Leah, who began farming in 1996, is the 2019 winner of the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award. She co-founded Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York, and in 2018 published Farming While Black, a how-to guide for aspiring African heritage growers to reclaim their inheritance as agriculturalists. Last year, she published Black Earth Wisdom, a collection of interviews with Black environmentalists. Her mission is to put our planet first and defer to nature as our teacher. Only then will we win the fight for racial and environmental justice. Both books are for sale out in our lobby by our bookseller, Frugal Books, and Leah will be signing after the conversation. Joining her interlocutor, is our own Kathleen Masterson, Assistant Managing Editor for Climate and Environment. We will be taking your questions throughout the hour. You go to slido.com and type in Penniman, and we'll send them to Kathleen to ask Leah. Please welcome Leah and Kathleen.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really exciting to see you all and to have Leah with us. I wanted to start, Leah, just to ask about how you got into all this. You write about exploring with your sister in nature. I know you worked at a farm in some of your teenage years. Could you tell us how did you kind of formulate the decision to even think about Soulfire Farm?
Oh my goodness, so it was completely by accident. I did not grow up in a farming family. I grew up in a small rural town in central Massachusetts, and our family was one of the only non-white families in the whole town. So needless to say, social exclusion was an issue, racialized bullying was an issue, and so my siblings and I found solace in the forest. Nature was truly our best friend, our babysitter, our mother, our teacher, and as our consciousness about environmental issues emerged, we learned about climate change and biodiversity loss. It felt like this personal assault on a family member. My sister and I formed the Junior Ecologist Kids Club when we were 6 and 5 years old. We went around on a pollution patrol. We were like, doing our 6-year-old version of saving the earth. And of course, this matured as we got older. So when it was time to get a job to start saving for college, I wanted to do something in service of the earth. And at my mom's church, there was a flyer for the food project. I don't know if you all know Boston Lincoln Food Project. So this was 1996. Grabbed the flyer, applied for the job, and was fortunate to be granted a position. And from that first moment of like hoeing a row and harvesting cilantro and the smell lingering in the creases of my fingers, it was like, oh, this is it. This is how you serve the earth and human community at the same time.
Wow, that's amazing. Very cool. This is too big a question to ask, but I do want to say, for people who are interested in sort of getting into agriculture, it's sort of a lot of what you describe is a return to a lot of traditions. I wonder, where would you give some high-level tips, like where to start? I know you have a whole book on this. You have a whole book, Farming While Black, which is full of tips and everyone should check out. But if you had to pick a couple, what advice would you give people looking to learn more? I know, it's too big.
Well, and it's small at the same time. So Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you need to read that hasn't been written, go and write it. And so Farming While Black was that. Because when I was coming up in farming, I was all about it. I was like, you can grow food and you can heal the soil and the biodiversity and you can feed communities. I mean, it just felt like everything. And then I looked around to my left and right at every NOFA conference, Northeast Organic Farming. It was like all white folks. It was like nobody who looked like me, and I'm light-skinned, And so I just felt like, am I just being a traitor? Did I get on the wrong train? I need to be working on issues that are pertinent to my community. So there was this real internal crisis of faith, in the path. And fortunately, my mentor, Karen Washington, who's now our president of our board at Soulfire, she's an amazing Black elder farmer. She founded the Black Urban Growers. She founded Rise and Root Farm. I mean, just incredible. She took me under her wing and said, our ancestors, our legacy, this is part of who we are. There is no borrowing in this path. So I say that because I think there's two things that are really needed to get into farming. One is to figure out your why, because it's not an easy career path. I mean, not to rain on this beautiful Earth Week, but farming has some of the highest rates of mental illness and suicidality. Farming is the lowest paid occupation for the hours worked, and so it's not just like all romantic and white dresses and picking flowers in baskets, So you've got to figure out your why. And for me, that Karen Washington, the ancestral legacy, was really important. And the other thing is get trained, A lot of folks don't understand how much skill goes into farming. You would never walk into a surgical room and be like, hand me the scalpel, Like you would never, ever do that. And yet folks sometimes think with farming, the first thing you do is just get some land and start.
Yeah.
Minimum 2 years, full-time apprenticeship.
Wow.
Minimum, in order to know what you're doing and not waste a lot of money and probably throw your back out. So get some training.
I got some great labor tips in there too on that really cool scythe that you mentioned. We're going to get into a lot of the meat of this, but just first, since people have seen some photos, I wonder if you could just describe a little bit about what is life like on the farm. How many people live there? I know this is your busy season, so thank you for coming to join us in the middle of what I'm sure is a chaotic time. But you give us a sense of like, how do you run things? How do you sort of set up the structures of humans at the farm?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. Boston is very near and dear in my heart because one, it's where I started farming. It's also where my mom grew up. So when you all reached out, I'm just so honored to be here. But so Soulfire Farm. Okay. So we are an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm, and our whole mission is to uproot racism and seed sovereignty in the food system, which is a huge mission. And the way we do that is basically 3 central program areas. So we grow a whole lot of food using our ancestral practices that sequester carbon, heal biodiversity, and we give almost all of that away through a doorstep delivery program to low-income folks. That's mostly where I focus. The second major thing we do is train and equip the rising generation of Black and brown farmers. So we have thousands of students coming through in all different kinds of programs, including our national fellowship. And then the third area is just rabble-rousing for systems change. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but, needless to say, our policies don't support the earth, and they don't support those who care for the earth, and they need to change. There's 18 of us who do that work. About half do it in the physical realm of either farming or hands-on educating or building things, and half are, behind computers and on planes and conference calls. And, we actually have a fly into DC to advocate for farm workers' rights. So, we're doing that kind of work as well. And my wonderful spouse, Jonah's here. He built everything on our campus. We have this beautiful new program center and dining commons, a classroom, some lodging facilities. So there are 4 families who live full-time, and then many thousands of guests who come through.
Amazing. Very cool. Well, let's take a look. We have a very short video clip so people can get a sense of the work and the joy.
Small-scale regenerative farms grow a lot of food, but they can also grow something else. Soil. The team at Soulfire Farm has increased their farm's soil organic matter from less than 2% to over 10%. And it's still increasing.
We have restored the soil organic matter to pre-colonial indigenous levels. We have captured tens of thousands of pounds of carbon into the soil. We've brought back pollinators. We've increased the biodiversity in the sky, in the water, in the soil. It's not just Soulfire Farm. There are thousands of farms like us who continue to feed the world. We are seeing an entire rising generation take those seeds that our ancestors braided into their hair and who are saying, we're gonna keep farming the ways that our ancestors have and innovate and build upon that, and that will continue to feed the world without destroying it.
Love it. Beautiful, beautiful. Awesome. I want to talk about some of those ancestral practices, but I did want to start with reading your book. I was really thinking, I was so struck by how much of it, from everyone, all of the Black environmentalists you interviewed, is really about listening to the earth. And I know that there's many layers to that, but I was curious if you could talk about that when it comes to farming. Obviously many ancestral practices were passed down, you've reconnected with some, but where does the listening to the earth play in?
Okay, so I have to share this incredible story that I came upon when researching for Black Earth Wisdom. And this is about Dr. George Washington Carver, who you may know from the classic Black History Month elementary school poster with a peanut next to his face, right? So Dr. Carver was a scientist in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Tuskegee, Alabama, who invented a lot of things with peanuts and sweet potatoes. And the reason he was so into these crops is because he was trying to figure out a way to heal the southern soils that had been ravished during slavery by cotton and tobacco production, monocrop. And realized that by planting leguminous crops such as peanuts and black-eyed peas, they fix nitrogen, these root nodules have a symbiosis between rhizobial bacteria and the plant, and they pull nitrogen down out of the sky. It's like this beautiful thing that nature does of making its own fertilizer. But anyway, he convinced an entire generation of Black farmers to do this crop rotation and cover cropping, and was in many ways the grandfather of the modern organic movement. This is before Rodale came on the scene in the 1940s and took credit for it, right? So all that to say, that alone is incredible. I mean, he had thousands of patents, but when I read a memoir by his mentee, there's this most beautiful passage where he asked Dr. Carver, where did you get all these ideas? And he said, oh, well, every morning I go out into the forest in the pre-dawn hours and I talk to God through nature. He said, nature is God's broadcasting system through which he speaks to us every hour, every minute, if we just tune into the right channel. He said, I never opened a single book to get any of those ideas. They all came to me directly from the divine in nature. I was like, mic drop, Dr. Carver. And what was fascinating is as I started interviewing all of these really renowned environmentalists, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, Drew Lanham, these ornithologists, these oceanographers, all of them talked about having an earth listening practice. That it wasn't just about the numbers being interpreted through scientific instruments, but having some direct connect. Drew Lanham can go into any environment, listen for a moment to the bird song, and tell you if everything's okay in the ecosystem. He's literate in the languages of the earth. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson can put on her scuba gear, go down in the coral reef, and instantly know if everything's okay because she's literate in the languages of the earth. And so I've been thinking a lot about that literacy, and when we've got so many layers of steel and concrete and glass between us and the earth, we can't see the sky, we can't see the moon, we've gained much, but what have we lost in terms of our capacity to tune into that primary source? We're on a secondary, tertiary, quaternary, source. And, if you've ever played telephone in elementary school, what happens when you pass the message to 20 people?
Gets pretty distorted.
Right? So if the universe is our primary source and none of us can read,
Yeah.
We're making our decisions based on these really distorted information as a society.
Do you feel like you've refound that on your own through connecting and in your own experience? I mean, I know in the book you write about a lot of trial and error that anyone would have, but did you develop that practice? Did that come to you?
So I'll let you in on something. I just thought I was alone and a super weirdo because I mentioned my sister and I early on in our childhood, but we had earth listening embedded in our practice. We're what they call double PKs, so PK is a preacher's kid, is how we refer to that. So both our parents are clergy. We're very involved in the church, and so grateful for that spiritual upbringing. But we decided that our religion that we were going to create was called Mother Nature. And so we went out into the woods and we created these little churches to Mother Nature, and we adorned them with blue jay feathers and swirls of birch bark, and we would tie a ribbon to a single tree and watch it grow over the years. I mean, we just had our whole own thing. Of course, much later, when I went to Ghana, West Africa, to volunteer and live for 6 months on one of those, find yourself kind of trips as a young adult, I apprenticed myself to the Queen Mothers in Ghana, who were fascinated by the cultural differences between the United States and their indigenous community. And one of the times they were quizzing me on life in the U.S., they said, Amidede, which was my name there, Amidede, is it true that in the United States farmers will put a seed in the ground and they won't sing or pray or pour libation or even say thank you to the earth and expect the seed to grow? I was like, yeah, that's mostly true. They were like, no wonder y'all sick, right? You're all sick because you treat the earth as the thing and not as the divinity that she is. So like we weren't actually inventing anything. We were just remembering this way.
Yeah. That's wild that she really had to check with you if that was true here.
Yeah.
I want to bring up an audience question and a reminder that folks can enter. I want to get the right name, slido.com, and Penniman is our code if you want to enter a question. But someone asked, how has listening to the land, the unlimited broadcasting station, been impacted by climate change?
Oh, it's heart-wrenching and really personal. The past 2 nights we've had low 20s for all night after these 80-degree days. I mean, and so all the little buds that have burst or then retracted and damaged back. We've had whole years of drought and then whole years where it just rains and rains. We've had the wildfires and the smoke impacting the air quality of our, for our workers and for our plants. We had no hard freeze all winter, so the pest insects are going to be terrible this year. Like on and on and on. And it's not theoretical, it's not in the future. And granted, I know that we have relative privilege. We're not on a small island that's disappearing. We're not in the Sahel where it hasn't rained all year. And so I'm very grateful for that capacity and resiliency. And at the same time, I was saying this to my friend the other day, it's like very hard to sit and meditate. My attention is always pulled to it almost feels like all the plants and animals outside are crying out. When there's a drought moment or a pest outbreak and they're calling. And more than once we're getting up in the middle of the night to go 10 to something.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I do remember you mentioned in the book about Hurricane Sandy and how that came through the farm, and you did get up in the middle of the night, was what reminded me, and ran out with the whole family to protect what you could. Can you talk about what practices you've learned or are learning to build in that resilience that we're all going to need for climate change?
Absolutely. So I'll refer to that story briefly. So this was, I think 2012 was Sandy or 2013. I always get mixed up now, but biggest tropical storm to hit our area in a generation. And it was the middle of the night and it sounded like this Mack truck or train was just barreling towards us. Of course, we're very rural. There was no Mack truck and there was no train, but it turned out that this river had just emerged through the forest where there was no river before, and it was barreling down towards the farm. And at that rate, it would have just washed out our whole garlic crop. It would have washed out all of our plants. And so Emmett, who's here, and Nashima were small. And so we woke the whole family up, put shovels in their hand, and started digging a trench to try to divert the river away from the main, most valuable crops. And in the morning, just the news report started coming in. All the farms in our county had lost almost all their topsoil. They're lower down than us. We're up in the mountains. The 2 roads that service our town, Route 2 and 22, were completely washed out, so you couldn't actually leave the town. And so townspeople had to fix the roads to get out. I mean, it was wild. And also very cute because Emmett, who was, again, much smaller than he is right now, was afraid that he'd get washed away. So he wore a life jacket around for several days as the waters receded. I have photo evidence of this. But our farm really sustained very little damage. And it wasn't just that our kids were amazing trench diggers. It's that we had been using these practices that we've referred to of no-till, of semi-permanent raised beds, of cover cropping, heavy mulches, high organic matter, perennial integration. And so, if you think about a slope, if you put a bunch of beds at contour, it's going to cause the water to slowly channel in the pathways, which increases infiltration. High organic matter also increases infiltration versus something that's just flat. The water comes and washes everything away. So we were... It was interesting and powerful to see that the very same practices that sequester carbon and hopefully help us save our climate also mitigate the impacts of real-time climate change. So you win on both counts, the now and the future.
So, okay, amazing. So a lot of what you do is building in for water. Too little, too much.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's what it is, right? Heat and water.
Yeah, heat, water, and pests, I'm sure. I want to talk a little bit about how we nationally got here. You write a lot in the book about the harmful kind of past of land theft in this country, people being kidnapped from Africa into slavery here. And you share a statistic in the book that in the last 100 years, there are just two, it's gone from 14% 1920 of Black farmers owning land to just 2%. So we're still seeing, even in more recent history, this really harmful trend. Can you talk about why did that loss continue? Like, what are we up against here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate this question because a lot of folks, when they think about food issues or climate issues, don't think about racial justice. That's starting to change, but certainly when we were getting started, people were like, what? What are you talking about? It's food, it's plants. But I will argue that racial injustice is just built into the DNA of the food system. And so if you imagine a double helix of the DNA of the food system, you have stolen land and exploited labor. And that is what the food system is built on, and it's morphed into different forms, but it fundamentally hasn't changed. Almost the entire continent was wrested away from Native folks in a genocidal displacement, right? And then 16 million African people were kidnapped and brought across, the ocean to work in the Caribbean and Brazil and the United States. And these weren't just laborers. I mean, these are agricultural experts. If you haven't read the work of Judith Carney, her really powerful anthropology work, she talks about specifically the technologies of like the Mende and Wolof people as rice growers and how they were kidnapped to start the rice industry in the Carolinas. And so, rice and cotton, and that doesn't grow in England, and sugar, it grows in West Africa. So, bringing agricultural experts. So all that to say, even in 1865, the official end of chattel slavery, the Southern economy wasn't ready to make a change. And so they morphed that system to convict leasing, which uses the loophole in the 13th Amendment that still allows slavery if you've been convicted of a crime. And so new crimes were invented, like loitering. That became a crime. Vagrancy became a crime. That means not having a job, specifically a 1-year contract on a plantation. Hanging around in groups of 3 or more became a crime. And so Black people were, the prisons filled, and then they were just leased back to the farms. And this was huge. I mean, this was 87% of Alabama's state budget in the Jim Crow era. It was like a lot of convict leasing. So then you had sharecropping, which is debt peonage system. But even despite that, I mean, our ancestors are incredible because saving money working second and third jobs, they managed to purchase 16 million acres of land by 1910. These little, ramshackle, mostly degraded pieces of land. And the backlash of that, the Tulsa massacres, there was over 4,500 Black people whose names we know who were lynched in the backlash against Black economic independence. So the Great Migration, when 6 million Black folks moved to the urban areas, was not the sort of sanitized version we get is like, oh, they just wanted to work in the factories in World War I. But it really was a refugee crisis. It was like, if you stayed in the South, you would be killed if you tried to not work on a plantation. So all that to say, throughout history, it's taken many forms. The H-2A system. Right now, we're dealing with Medicare land grabs. We're dealing with retirement company land grabs. And probably most importantly, the U.S. Department of Agriculture continues to discriminate against Black farmers, not allowing them to have the same financial supports as white farmers. There's a lawsuit right now. Anyway, on and on. So Black folks would love to keep farming. Trust me, we have a waiting list around the block for our programs, but there are a number of structural barriers that are, often unseen, and that's the reason why 98% of the agricultural land is white-owned in this country today. It's not because other people would not like to also own some.
Yeah, no, thank you. What is Medicare land grab? Just
okay, so actually, Jillian Hishaw wrote a book about this, if you want to look up more about it. But essentially Medicare, I don't know if it's Medicaid too, but Medicare is a loan in some respects. And so if you, is it Medicaid that's a loan? Thank you, I appreciate it. Medicaid is a loan. So if you end up in a nursing home or you're using health insurance as an elder, and you die and you have assets, they can be seized, right? And so what has happened in a lot of Black families is land is owned in something called kinship commons. There's not necessarily a will or a shared deed. Maybe grandma technically owns the land, but grandson is farming the land and the great-grandchildren are going to school in the school district. Grandma dies, the land is seized by the government, the whole family is homeless. So that's been happening a lot in this generation of Black families in the South.
Yeah, And I've just got a few other notes. Federal law requires states to seek reimbursement from the assets.
Yeah.
Usually
Thank you.
the homes.
Yeah.
Thanks to Stephen
I'm
for
like
that.
Jillian's book. She's the expert
No,
on that.
you detailed it really well.
We did take my mom's little tiny cabin. We're like, you have to give it to us 10 years before you die.
Get that in writing. Get that in writing. I want to talk a little bit about connectivity and reestablishing connectivity and sort of fighting back against erasure of a lot of these practices. And you describe in the book and the video how, like, when people were kidnapped from Africa, they put seeds, braided seeds into their hair. And one way of, showing the importance of agriculture and growing food, how central that was to life, but also a way that brought things to this country. Are there a few practices that you could talk about and highlight, and even talk a little bit too about how those were passed down and how you're kind of you and others are trying to bring them back to life? That's a lot.
Oh, absolutely. I love that you bring the seed braids. So this was another incredible story that came out of Judith Carney's work. She's just such an incredible anthropologist. But so our grandma's generation, seeing that so many of their family members were being, kidnapped and taken and forced into ships, there was no report backs. They took their most precious commodity and started carrying it with them in case they were next. And that was their seed. Their molokia, their black rice, their agusi melon, their black-eyed pea, their amara kale. And so anytime they would braid their hair, they would put seeds into their hair. So they would always have their seeds with them. Wow. Just like in a time of, and they did this, even before that, in times of war and famine and displacement, was, this is just how, no matter what, if someone takes your clothes and everything off of you, you have your seeds. Yeah. And so a lot of those seeds made it, to the shores. They made it into the provision garden. So I'm sure many of you know this, but during slavery, our enslaved ancestors would be granted a certain amount of rations, usually like some pork fat and some cornmeal, but anything else they wanted to eat, they had allotment yards where they had to grow their food, after working 12, 14-hour days, 6 days a week. So these seeds of melon, so we still have the melon, we have the black-eyed pea, we have the eggplant, we have many of these seeds. So when we say carrying on the seed, it's literally we seed save. But also they brought so much knowledge with them. I mentioned the rice growers, but of course there's also the African dark earth compost of Liberia and Ghana, which is like second only to the Amazonian dark earth in terms of its nutrient content. So we have the composting technologies. We have the raised beds of the Ovambo people, which is why we don't lose all of our soil. We have the polycultures of Nigeria, and on and on. And a big part of Farming While Black was to scour the literature, start with a hypothesis that all this cool regenerative organic stuff we do most likely has some Black Indigenous roots. Let's see. It turns out to be very true. And to lift that up and bring that forward.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. So really scouring the literature, talking to people. That's wonderful. I'm going to quote you here. You write, "When we as Black people are bombarded with messages that our only place of belonging on land is as slaves, performing dangerous and back-breaking menial labor, to learn of our true and noble history as farmers and ecological stewards is deeply healing." Can you talk about, are more people learning about this rich history? Is that narrative changing at all?
Oh, it absolutely is. It's been so powerful. I mean, when Jonah and I first wed ourselves to this 80 hardscrabble acres in Grafton, New York in 2006, I was like, okay, we're just going to be lonely. Like, that's what we're doing. I cried some big, ugly tears because as soon as we moved out there, there was a huge snowstorm the next day. One of those snowstorms that's so bad that your tractor plow just falls in the ditch, like falls over, and we're just trapped in the woods. I was like, I miss the city. I had to go back. You could not have convinced me at that time that we would be like turning people away who want to come learn to farm and just trying to find some personal time. It has been so healing and powerful to understand the ways that I have to deconstruct my own internalized racism, my own narrative that Black and brown folks like aren't interested, aren't connected to the earth, don't want to get dirty, this, that, and the third. It was like from the moment we opened our doors, people had been waiting for a culturally relevant, safe, supportive space to reconnect to our heritage. And, I'm trained as a scientist, and so I think I teach a pretty good soil chemistry class. I really enjoy doing that kind of stuff. And then it would surprise me because all of the evaluations at the end of the programs would be like, now I know what's possible, you know? Like, I'm never gonna go back to the bullshit anymore. I'm gonna get free on the land, you know, like, I'm gonna put down the bottle and leave this toxic relationship and this dead-end job and like find the thing. And so I say all that a little bit, you know, I smile through it, but it really is powerful to understand how much the earth, in addition to feeding us in this material way, is offering this intangible psycho-spiritual benefit. I think about it as spiritual composting. It's like we come with all our baggage and our trauma, including this ancestral trauma of the land really being the scene of the crime, not the criminal, but the scene of the crime, right? And you make that contact, and she's just like thirsty to take it and just turn it and give it back to us as hope and belonging and fortitude. And I've now seen that happen thousands of times. So I like have no doubt that she's just like the best therapist. You don't even have to pay anybody any money. You can just come volunteer on my farm every other Tuesday. You're gonna get the therapy you need. It'll be great.
That's amazing. We've got a question here about the crucial history of the contribution to agriculture that enslaved ancestors brought to the U.S. is generally not taught. Why? Why should and what should change?
Well, I think we know why it's not. I think we know why. I mean, history tends to be written in ways that justify the unequitable distribution of power, right? And so if folks want to hold on to wealth and power and land and their congressional seats, there needs to be a narrative that supports superiority. I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And as soon as you start to crack open that narrative, people will question, well then, if Black and brown folks are such good farmers and they brought all this stuff, how come they don't own any land? How come they're not the managers? How come being a farm manager is the whitest profession? It alternates each year with a veterinarian. But being a farm laborer is the brownest profession. I wonder why, you know, and so that's the why. And the how is exactly what you all are doing here. I mean, I think it's very important. Like, what is more important than food? How long can we go without food? How long can we go without agriculture? And yet it's strangely missing from the discourse, from our elementary school curriculum, our high school curriculum, the Common Core. Like, you could go through, and I tell this funny story, but it's also a tragic story. You know, I've done a lot of youth education, and there was one time I was teaching a young person how to milk a cow. This was at the farm school in Orange, Athol, Massachusetts. And the child got real pensive as he was like squeezing out the milk. He said, "Miss Leah, doesn't hamburger come from cows?" I was like, Brett getting ready to have the talk, you know. And he's like, "But which one do you squeeze?"
Oh, buddy.
I was like, "Oh, child, no, you have to kill the cow." What? Right? The carrot comes from the earth. Like, that basic level of food literacy is missing, much less like understanding the complexity of contributions and equity. But yet we must, right? Because we've got, you know, according to the Common Ground film research, we have 50 harvests left before we've destroyed our soil on this planet. That is not a lot of time. So we probably should all get to be part of that conversation, but a different way.
Yeah. You called yourself a scientist. Is that identity closer to your truth than farmer? Or are they the same? Interesting audience question.
Oh,
Thank you.
that's great. I think they're the same. Yeah, I mean, to be a farmer, you need to be a plumber, a mechanic, a scientist, an HR director, like a TV evangelist for the earth, you know. So I think it's all the same. But my training is, my undergrad was in environmental biology, and then I was a high school biology, environmental science, and chemistry teacher for 17 years. So I only stopped teaching in the classroom actually right before the pandemic. By accident, a little angel probably whispered in my ear and said, "It's time to quit." So I didn't have to Zoom teach.
You were listening. Another great question, is there a place for technology alongside Indigenous practices in healing farm practices?
Oh, this is such a good question. So our oldest child, Nashima, is actually going to be a rising senior and is studying environmental science and ag and edited Black Earth Wisdom. So shout out to Nashima. But we had a whole conversation about this because there can be this misunderstanding that somehow Indigenous technology, Indigenous wisdom is frozen in time, that it's ancient, primitive, and fixed. But in fact, if you look at the annals of history, Indigenous knowledge and wisdom, like every society, has evolved over time with adapting conditions. Our daughter right now is in Panama with the Guna people studying their Nainu agricultural system, which is like this incredible forest-based ag system that has changed and continued to change and adapt into new environments. And so they're not at all antithetical. I kind of, the way Nishima encourages us to frame it is to think about the scientific method, which is very old. This idea of experimentation, of using observation in order to test our hypothesis, to disprove our hypothesis. And yet this template can be applied even to the most advanced question in astrophysics. In a similar way, an Indigenous framework on agriculture, which is centered on earth listening, an understanding of kin-centric relationships, an understanding of closed-loop production and cycling of nutrients, and on, that this framework, which we talk about in Black Earth Wisdom, is ancient and old, but it is continually applicable and open to innovation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Since we're sort of on that thread, you'll do a better definition than me. Could you tell us what is regenerative agriculture and why is it a crucial component as we face climate catastrophe?
Well, I know there's been recent attempts to codify this, so I'll probably not get that right. I'll tell you what I understand it to be. So one thing I love about regenerative versus sustainable is that sustainable is talking about maintaining a status quo, but we're in a pretty funky status quo right now that we probably don't want to maintain. And so regenerative is about restoring and improving this idea that, so I'll tell you a story and then I'll extract some principles. So Tiffany Lachey, who is a Black soil scientist, super brilliant, she comes and guest lectures at a lot of our workshops and programs. And she was there a couple years ago with her giant auger to dig these soil cores. So this is a cool tool that you have to work really hard in our soil to push into the ground. And then you pull out these cylinders, and then you go down, you pull out these cylinders and lay them out. And you can read them historically. So, I'm just seeing shades of brown. But she goes, oh, here is, 6,000 years ago, this is when Mohican and Haudenosaunee folks were burning and managing the forest, and you can see the burn whatever, right? It's to have more deer and blueberries and blackberries. And she reads through several other points. She said, here's 1800s, which the sheep craze. There were millions of sheep in upstate New York. There was a whole wool boom that was happening. Anyway, so she's reading through, and she goes, and here at the top, this is the soil that you all built in the 14 years that you've been here.
Wow.
She's like, it'll compress, but it will be in the geological record forever.
Wow.
I was like, what? You just the idea of life goals just went to a geological timescale. I want to be in the geological record, not as plastic and death, but as organic matter. That is amazing. So cool. So, that's the story of regenerative, but in sort of practical terms, to be regenerative means to be no-till, not flipping the soil over because that releases a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and to have the soil covered in cover crops or mulches. Our regenerative adds in more, we do mostly perennial ag and have a certain diversity of crops, but I think at minimum, no-till, no chemicals, and cover.
Yeah. Has that been shown to sort of be more resilient? I know it's a basic question, but are we more hopeful? Do we have a sense that it'll be more resilient to heat and flooding and all of that work?
Oh, absolutely. So I definitely have to shout out, if you haven't seen the new documentary that's out, Common Ground, on regenerative agriculture, they did a really nice job, and they follow regenerative farms around the country, and they get all the stats and everything you need. So it's screening right now. It's not streaming yet, but it's definitely worth seeing. But something that struck me about some of the earlier research out of Rodale is that if you measure yields of a conventional farm over just a 1-year period, it always beats out organic and regenerative. And so people will tout that of you can't feed the world, with regenerative because the yields are lower. But as soon as you zoom out to a 5-year time scale, regenerative and organic catches up. Plus you get the nutrient benefits and the biodiversity in the soil. Why does it catch up? It catches up because 5 years is long enough to have a climate chaos event, a flood, a drought, a pest outbreak, something going wrong. And so regenerative and organic are more resilient to these bumps. And so their yields catch up. And so that, to me, those stats to me are really, really powerful because we are, I will tell you as a farmer, no season is predictable at this point. Every year I'm like, okay, now we're gonna plant earlier. Oh no, now we'll plant later. Now we'll irrigate, now we won't irrigate. I mean, it's like very hard to figure out what the earth is doing right now.
That makes sense. I remember one of the things from the interview that really stuck out to me. There's so many different signs that people have historically used to know about when to plant, but you had a bite in there about when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear, and I just loved that. I'm like, I don't think that's probably true anymore with climate change,
Right.
but that was beautiful. That was beautiful. All right, a very big picture question for you, and I'm sure you've thought lots about this, but if you could rebuild our food system in the U.S., what would it look like?
Well, hopefully we can work together on that because I don't have all the expertise, but I am really inspired by the Via Campesina vision for the food system. So if folks haven't heard of them, they're an international indigenous peasant movement, the largest in the world ever, across every continent, that is organizing, across borders to try to redesign the food system. And if you think about, again, to quote Nishima, like if you think of the food system as everything that it takes to get sunshine onto your plate, there's all of these points along the way of soil and water and land and seed and worker and distributor and, consumer. And if you think about infusing democracy and fairness and regeneration into each one of those steps, that's the food system we need. What does it look like for the land to be shared? What does it look like for the rights of seeds to be held with Indigenous people? What does it look like for everyone to have fresh, healthy, culturally appropriate, nutritious, affordable food? What does it look like? And on and on. And so there's no quick, easy answer because it is a complete redesign. Right now, the food system is built on greed and exploitation and profit, but it really needs to be built on the well-being of all beings.
An audience question, then I have another one for you. But what do you think is the future of agriculture? Do you think there is a utopian agricultural system?
Utopian
And it's a
agricultural
big word.
system. Oh my goodness. So I honestly don't know, fam. I mean, there are definitely very discouraging days, and I take a pretty pragmatic stance on hope. So if you follow me with this thought experiment for a minute. So if you were to, rather than hope and work towards that utopian future, if there is one, and instead adopt a posture of despair, or if I were to adopt a posture of despair, I wouldn't get out each day and do the work that I do. It's hard work, right? I wouldn't feed the community. I wouldn't invest in the soil because there's no point, right? And so the end result of that would be the utopia will actually never happen because we've all checked out. But also in real time, there's harm by not doing that. Because in real time, I'm feeding people who don't have food. I am protecting the lives of tiny, necessary, invisible creatures below my feet, right? I am welcoming the hummingbird moths back into our bee balm patch where they haven't been for at least a generation, right? And so even if we never get there, which I hope we do, if we act as if we will, there's at least a real-time incremental benefit to actual living beings on the earth right now who have value. Yeah. So that is my pragmatic approach to hope.
I like it. We all got to get out of bed, and you certainly do a lot when you do. So, just since we've been talking a lot about the very hard work and the land side, I wanted to just acknowledge what you attribute to Karen Washington, food apartheid. Can you just tell us a little bit about what is the challenge that we're facing and some of the work that you do to bring food to people?
Oh, absolutely. So when Joan and I were living in the south end of Albany, which is a neighborhood under food apartheid with our then very young children, there was no grocery store or farmer's market or available community garden plots. It was very hard to get fresh food. We didn't even have a bus line to get to the supermarket at that time. And so the only way we could get fresh food was to join a CSA, which was very expensive, and walk 2.2 miles to the drop-off, and then bring the vegetables back like piled on the children, right? So of course our neighbors, when they found out we wanted, that we knew how to farm, they wanted us to start this farm. So food apartheid is a term coined by Karen Washington in response to the government's term of food desert. There is nothing natural about a certain segment of the population having Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and Green Market, and another segment of the population having a liquor store, a corner store, and a McDonald's. You can look at the very same zip codes that have the liquor store and the McDonald's, and you can see that those are the neighborhoods that were redlined, in the era of legal housing discrimination. Those are the same neighborhoods that are over-policed, where the schools are underfunded, right? And so to call it what it is, because apartheid is a human-created system of segregation, and it can be fixed. Deserts can't, well, with the exception of this really dope person in Burundi, but generally deserts are what they are. So all that to say, to call it apartheid might seem jarring, but it also gives some hope, because we don't want a situation where Black and brown communities have disproportionate burdens of heart disease and kidney failure and other diet-related illnesses, where children have trouble learning because they're not getting enough vitamins and minerals and, balanced diet throughout the day. We really want a situation where everybody has the food that they deserve to live and thrive.
Yeah, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
You had mentioned, and an audience question, greed, exploitation, and profit. How do you convince people in charge of a system like this to change?
Oh my goodness. So the first thing that came to mind, which I don't even know if this is what I think, but so one of our best friends is this really great, amazing Japanese Buddhist monk. Her name is Junsen Yasuda, and she's 75 years old. She's at the Napanza Miyohoji Grafton Peace Pagoda right down the street from us. It's why we're in Grafton, is because of this wonderful person. And so we do a lot of peace walks with her and prayer walks with her. I mean, again, if you haven't looked up Napanza Miyohoji, they walked from Auschwitz to Nagasaki, peace walking. That was a 6-month walk. They walked from South Africa to Cape Coast, took a boat, walked across Brazil, the Caribbean, then from Louisiana up the Underground Railroad to Canada. That was a Black Solidarity walk, 2 years, praying every step. So Junsen would say, to change people's minds, you have to worship the spark of good inside of them by bowing to them, saying Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. And in that moment of like deep respect and dialogue and connection and reverence, transformation is possible. So maybe, I'm very open to that. I get in debates with Junsen. Or we can just look at what these amazing young people are doing, where you stand up. You don't wait for somebody to transform and change their minds. You go and take the power that needs to be taken and demand the change that needs to be made. And so I think building our political power in our communities is really crucial as well.
I did want to ask, how is Soulfire Farm working to equip that next generation? Like, what can you talk a little bit more about that work that you're doing to train folks to do this work, both activism and the actual soil work? I was going to say dirt, but you're a scientist.
Yeah, right, it's soil.
You're a scientist,
not dirt.
yeah.
No, I'm not offended by that. Some people are really offended. Well, I will say that we have a few spots left in our summer camp. So our Liberation on Land Youth Immersion is back. And it's when we work with teens over the course of a week. Emmett is one of the trainers and mentors. It's an arts and farming integration. So all that to say, we welcome young people. We have everyone there from the day program to the week-long camp. We have our Braiding Seeds fellows who we support to get their farms off the ground all across the country. And so the way I think about working with these young people, and I'm including the 20-somethings who've kind of emerged from teenhood, is we want them to feel as though our generation totally has their back. So we've actually formed a consortium of organizations. So Soulfire does the rural training, but Farm School NYC does the urban training. Black Farmer Fund is the capitalization vehicle that provides non-extractive loans and grants. We have Corbin Hill Food Project that will buy all the food they grow and redistribute it in the Bronx. There's Black Farmers United, which is the policy advocacy arm of the work, and the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust that'll link you to land. So we want this rising generation that's had so much against them to just look around in every direction and be like, oh, y'all really have thought of everything I need and absolutely have my back. So that's how we're trying to equip them.
That's really cool. That is very comprehensive. It takes, yes, so much to be a farmer. You've really talked about many parts of this, but how does land sovereignty for Black and Indigenous people pertain to climate healing?
Oh, right. So I started mentioning a little bit about the Nainu system in Panama, which is one of the most sustainable farming systems in the world. Essentially, what the Nainu system does is it uses the forest as a cover crop. So if you imagine, clearing the forest, burning to release the nutrients, planting for a few years, and then moving to another area in such a way that you don't come back to the original area for a generation. the entire forest regrows as the cover crop. And it sequesters so much below ground biomass that it actually acts as a carbon sink. It's an agricultural system that is improving the environment over time. The only reason slash and burn got a bad rap is because colonizing forces took over all the land, forced indigenous communities onto really small areas, and they had to reduce the rotation to like 3 or 5 year rotations. And so that's not enough time. So I mentioned that system, but also like if you look at the Menominee forest management, they have one of the most sustainable forest management systems in the United States. It's an indigenous tribe in Wisconsin. They've been doing this for 150 years. You know, I talked about the Ovambo people. I talked about the compost. These technologies that we need in order to save the climate come from indigenous communities. Indigenous communities steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous managed lands protect more biodiversity per acre than any other managed lands in the world. There is no way we are going to make it through the Anthropocene without the leadership of, and yet the land is being taken away from these communities. These communities are literally being killed off as they try to defend their land. Their languages are being lost. So I feel like we just all need to complete about face and just ask the indigenous communities of the world, like, how can we be of service to your vision of sustaining this biome, because we have not been able to, right, as a Western-dominated global society.
Right. Back to that listening.
Yeah, exactly. Listen to the listeners. Listen to
good.
those who are still fluent in the language of the earth.
I like that. A question from the audience. What role do you think, and this related to our ecosystems, what role do you think that growing mushrooms can play in producing food equitably?
I love it. I don't know if we have any mushroom pictures on that slideshow, but we love growing mushrooms. And my sister Naima is such a mycophile. So we've grown mushrooms for a long time, but this past year built this incredible, I don't know what you call it, it's like a mushroom zone. So all of the shiitake and maitake logs are in this circle, and you can take mallets and play them like a balafone, which actually shocks them into producing more. So like the kids come, and then we've inoculated all the wood chip pathways, which are many on the farm. Our farm is about 70% perennials, so they're inoculated with waste substrate from the local mushroom producers. So we have like all of these, everything popping up. We have like lion's mane popping up. So all that to say, we love mushrooms, and on a very practical sense, I'm sure you all know this, but mycorrhizal fungi is the internet of the forest and the internet of agroforest. So a single tree is not an island. A single tree will share its sugars and messages and minerals with all the other trees and plants in its area through the internet of mycelium. And Susan Simhard did some incredible work on this if you haven't read her work, but it's so inspiring for us, and again, such a model if you think about in human communities that tendency to greed and hoard that can sometimes happen. And the forest doesn't just support kin, non-kin, other species get included in this sharing. They're like, look out, the pests are coming. Everybody put up your defenses. Do you want a mast? Like, let's do our nuts all at the same time so we overwhelm the squirrels. And then, it's like super, trees are amazing, but they can't do it without fungi. So we need fungi also to save the world.
Very cool. I love that reenactment of it. It's very good. I had a student who studied some of the chemical pathways that plants use to communicate, and he took my how do you communicate science class, and he had a whole telephone thing going too. So it was great.
I spend too much time with trees. So I'm like,
no, it's lovely. This is going to be a tough one, but an audience question: what crop that you grow at Soulfire do you believe best represents the experience of Black folks in the United States? And why?
oh my God.
One crop? I don't know.
Well, I thought you were going to ask like my favorite crop, and I was like, that's not hard. It's strawberries. But I'm not sure that that's like the Black crop. But like, I love strawberries. Though I will say, well, maybe I'll stick with it because I don't think there's one crop. I mean, I think what's most important is when we connect to our why, it's also connecting to our own personal and ancestral stories. So for me, my first gardening experience was with my grandma, actually here in Boston. And she had a strawberry patch in her tiny backyard. This was like what she could take with her from Rock Hill, South Carolina, after being displaced in the Great Migration. And I remember picking the strawberries in her yard and making jam, and just the smell that fills the house. If you've ever made berry jam. If you haven't, definitely do it. The smell is like incredible. And the magic of those little red treasures like hiding under the leaves and stuff. So strawberries are still my favorite crop to grow. I think we're trying to get a strawberry tattoo, right? Is that happening? That's happening.
And they do taste so much sweeter when you grow them yourself. I used to guard them from the crows, and I never won. Like the second you turn away, the crows come in.
Exactly. And so you're only getting the almost ripe ones because they just eat all the ripe
Yes.
ones.
Well, this has been wonderful. I have a question to wrap up for you. Could you share? You've shared so many things, but some sort of the most important or your favorite things that you learned in writing Black Earth Wisdom.
Oh my goodness. I cried so much writing that book. You know, I mean, I feel like the little Leah really needed to find that community of earth-loving Black people to heal something, you know. But something that just stood out to me so much of all the interviews was hearing, it wasn't just Drew Lanham, but he's the ornithologist, but so many people echoed this of nature being this place free of judgment for them as Black people. You know, he's been doing these bird counts for years and years. He's like, I've never gone into the forest and had the warbler be like, where are you from? Why are you here? You know, like, what's going on? And so that idea of nature, not only as a composter of our trauma, but as this endless warm embrace, is such a model for us of non-discrimination and of universal compassion. Like, we are all equal in the eyes of our Mother Earth, in the embrace of our Mother Earth. And so that is something that holds me through the hard times.
It's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you so much.
It's been an honor to talk with you. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Wonderful.